Well, thank you very much for those wonderful words of introduction. Before I embark upon a conversation with Dame Fanny, or to me, Fanny, if she'll permit me to call her that.
Certainly.
I've been given permission to call her Fanny, so we all know why we're here. We're here to celebrate the life of a most remarkable person, a great citizen of this great city. And I could spend the next half an hour talking about her without giving her a word in edgeways, but that would not be acceptable to you and certainly not acceptable to her. But you will have seen, some of you at any rate, some of the wonderful documents and photographs outside. Leeds University, I think, is very lucky to have them. It's a wonderful act of generosity on her part, quite typical of the great person that she is. And there are some wonderful things there, letters from Benjamin Britten to her, a lot of documents from the competition, including her comments on the performances of some now extremely famous pianists, not all of them entirely complimentary. A wonderful archive. So as I say, I think the university is very happy, very lucky to have all of that. But enough from me by way of introduction. Fanny, I'd like, the best place to start is usually the beginning. So can we start with the beginning of your life and have a brief word about your family life and your parents and how it was you got into the world of music?
Well, my father came from Russia, and he was trained there to be a wonderful designer of jewellery and all kinds of things connected with beauty. And I remember, as a very young girl, watching him in his shop putting diamonds together, and it reminded me rather of Mozart. Mozart isn't the loudest when you hear his compositions, but they are perhaps the greatest because of the finery, because of their emotions. And so somehow that must have had an effect on me. My mother was born in Leeds, and we were a very poor family, but my father always emphasized on me to be content, because there was always someone over the hill who would know more than me, have more money than me, etc., etc. And their values were marvellous. He would say, never value anything that money can buy, but value good health, beauty, reliability. And having been brought up in that atmosphere from the age of 4, I think this had quite an influence on my whole life. And I went to a wonderful school, Chapel Allerton High School. The headmistress used to take the prayers. I used to play for all the prayers, so I know every hymn in ancient and modern. And I know 3 versions of the Lord Mayor's Prayer.
Can we just have a word about how you got into music? Was there music in the family? I mean, they didn't have CDs and things like that in those days, but how did you get into music?
Well, there was always an upright piano. I remember climbing on the stool, and I remember playing the dishes of the day, kind of all cheap little bits of rubbish. And my teacher was not the very best, because while I was having the lessons, she was cooking her husband's meal. So I say I could only help her culinary, ability was much better than her teaching. It would be tiptoe through the tulips and in a monastery garden. When we had Bartok and all the wonderful composers, Bach and all those, but she, of course, didn't know them. So she wasn't my inspiration at all.
But you did have the opportunity to go and have lessons in London from time to time. How did that come about?
Yes, my father had met someone from the Yorkshire Post who knew all the artists, and he heard me play, and he was very impressed, although I was only 17, I can't think I was all that good. And he said that he thought if I did music and I taught, I would be an inspiration to my teachers. So that was how I met Myra Hess, and at that time, she was, as you probably know, a great artist. The Queen Mother used to attend all her recitals at the National Gallery, and she was approached, and she wrote back to say she wouldn't take any pupils because she was working 25 hours a day, but she recommended me to go to Tobias Mattei in London, and the fees were 4 guineas for 1 hour, 3 guineas for 2 hours, and 1 guinea for 1 hour, which my father naturally didn't have, so I only went occasionally to him. And then after that, I got a scholarship to the Royal College of Music, where I studied with Cyril Smith.
Now, can we just leave it there for the moment? Because I'd like to just ask you a little bit about the musical life of Leeds when you were a schoolgirl, because I think you used to go to the town hall and hear some of the great artists of the day, like Rachmaninoff and others. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, there was Stein, and because of Marian Harwood, who was the Countess, and all the people who visited Harwood House, Stein was staying there, and she asked him if he would listen to my pupils. So 4 of them went there, and he was very complimentary, A, about my teaching, and A, about them. But, he said, I remember him poking his finger at me, he said, it's not how they play now, it's how they play in 20 years' time, and that is quite true. At that age, and I had 2 pianos, if I played a phrase and they were musical enough, they could copy me. But later on, in 20 years' time, they had to have their own individuality. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the same as just being a mere copycat of a teacher.
Yes. So, going back then to the college, Royal College, tell us a little about that. You had lessons with Cyril Smith, I think, is that right?
Yes, lessons with Cyril Smith. At those days, he was the greatest British pianist. They didn't travel around, and I enjoyed his lessons very much. And there were glass windows on the doors, and I always used to peep in to see if he was there, because if he was very busy and playing at a promenade concert, there would be some other deputy, which didn't please me at all. But one day, a few of us were called to Dyson, who was the head of the Royal College, to say that we were of the age to be called up. So that meant that I would have to look for a reserved occupation, and the one that they thought was chosen for me was being kind of digging and I forgot what you call it. But anyway, I'd never done that. So I returned to Leeds and I taught there. And I realised then that my real mission, apart from playing the piano, was teaching. And to this day, in my opinion, teaching is the greatest profession in the world. Whatever you're going to do, you need fine teachers. I'm not at all interested when I see the government are paying millions of pounds for wonderful buildings. It's not the buildings. You can teach well in an attic, but we need the great teachers, and this is where they come in, from America, from Russia, from China. The Chinese have got a marvellous school of piano playing.
So you went into teaching, and somehow you attracted some really extremely gifted young pupils. And there is, for people may have seen outside, there is a photograph of 4 of your young gifted pupils, Alan Schiller, Michael Roll, Kathleen Jones, and Wendy Waterman, whom I'm delighted to see, your niece is delighted to see, is here today. She's come from Switzerland. And those 4, who must have been about, I'm guessing, about 10 or 11 years of age or thereabouts, sitting, I think all of them in their school uniform, which is what happened in those days, sitting on the piano stool at the piano. And I can remember coming to concerts given by your pupils in the old Leeds City Museum, which had been damaged by the war. I remember the front half had been demolished. And you, I think, had once a year, you had concerts for your pupils. And I, who was not your pupil at that time, went along with my brother and my parents. And I was amazed at the quality of the playing of these young people. And so how did this come about? I mean, I'm sure you'll tell us that you just were a good teacher. You probably, I mean, I have no doubt that that is the case. But you did attract some remarkably gifted young people.
Well, I think teachers are made. You can't learn about it. Yeah. And I think that the fact that we have this musical, Mozart and the great pieces to teach, inspired me. And Alan Schiller was the first of them. And there should be a photo somewhere here of Alan, a little boy, who was asked, "Can you play Mozart K453?" And he looked at me and I said, yes. At that time, he'd only played a Scarlatti Sonata, but he was invited to play with Sir John Barbirolli and the Halley Orchestra. And when he played in Edinburgh, there were big headlines because Isaac Stern, who was then the greatest violinist in the world, was also on at that programme. And the Edinburgh Scotsman said, "Alan Schiller takes Edinburgh by storm." That was absolute rubbish. It was a good lesson for older people to know never appear with a child or a dog on the stage.
There was, when I was 10, for 3 years between the age of 10 and 13, I had piano lessons from Christine Brown, who had been one of your pupils, I think. And whilst I was a pupil of hers, I took part in one of those Harrogate piano competitions. Yes. Do you remember those?
Yes.
And I played one of those Bach little preludes from Anna Magdalena's notebook.
Yes.
And came runner-up to a girl called Nicola Grunberg.
Yes.
Who was one of your pupils.
Lovely pianist.
Lovely pianist. And so, at the age of 13, somehow or other, my parents persuaded you to take me on as a pupil. Can you remember how that happened? Because I can't.
I don't think I need any persuading. It was love at first sight.
I see you haven't lost your. You have not lost your art, Fanny.
Well, when John came to me and he'd left, I used to say to Geoffrey, "That boy is going far." He had respect. That is what we don't have very often today. Respect for your teachers, because after your parents, they're the most important people in your lives. And when John had lessons and I corrected notes, he didn't come back the next week with uncorrected notes. He had examined the scores, which probably stood you in good stead in your last job as Master of the Rolls. I mean, there's a difference between words and the way they're placed and where the phrasing is. And I noticed that John took all this side very seriously and enjoyed it.
Well, I did. I have a very, very clear recollection of my 4 years with you. I used to come on a Sunday morning with my mother, because you always insisted on a parent accompanying the child. to make sure that the parent also took on board all the things that you were trying to put across. And my lesson was between 11 and 12 o'clock on a Sunday morning, after Alan Schiller, who was between 10 and 11, and before Michael Roll, who was between... And at about 10 to 12 every Sunday morning, Michael would come in with his unforgettable Viennese mother, Greta.
Yes.
And they would listen to the last few minutes of my lesson. And there I was, sandwiched between these two extremely gifted and at the time quite famous, and went on to be quite famous pianists. And I never aspired to that kind of success. But as you say, I worked hard at it. And you were a very, very firm teacher. You never raised your voice.
Oh, no.
You never raised your voice, well, not to me, as far as I can. Maybe I've blotted it out if you did. But you were always, as far as I can remember, you were always very fair. Firm but fair, which I think really is what a good teacher should be. And I gained an enormous amount from having those lessons with you. And I still have a total passion for music, but particularly the piano. And I still play, although I wouldn't dare to play for you today, but I still play. And
Later, we'll invite him.
So I'm extremely grateful to you. But by the time I was approaching 17, I was getting very stuck into A-levels, and I got stuck on, you won't remember this, but I got stuck on the third list Liebestraum. And try as I did, I couldn't quite
coordinate.
I couldn't get it to your satisfaction. So in the end, we decided that we should stop. But I've never stopped playing the piano, and as I say, I'm eternally grateful to you. So I just thought it might be of interest to people here to hear very briefly what it was like to be your pupil all those years ago, from the perspective of somebody who did not have huge talent, but who was prepared really to work very hard at it and get a lot out of it. Well, perhaps we can move away from me and my experiences and have a little word about Marian Thorpe, because I know you have very strong feelings that Marian, who was so important to you in your life and with regard to the competition, has been something of an unsung hero or heroine. Would you like to say a little bit about her?
Yes. Marian's father was a great musician, Owen Stein, and Benjamin Britten had gone over to Vienna to see if Owen Stein could help him with getting some of his works more publicised. I don't know what happened to that, but when the Steins had to leave Vienna because of the Anschluss, they knew no one in England except Benjamin Britten. And they contacted Ben, and the upshot was that Ben became the housekeeper of Ben. And that was where Marian met Ben. And through Marian met Ben, she met the world, because she then married George Harwood, and she had all the royal connections, and Ben was just starting the Aldborough Festival with all the great artists of the days, and Marian would meet them all, and as a result of her and Geoffrey and me being the greatest friends, I loved Marian. We met all her contacts, the Princess Mary and all those people, and we were invited to all those functions. And contact can be very important. I'm not talking about a contact that might get you something, a deal in business. I'm talking about being near great artists, hearing their language, what they respected, and it was like having lessons near Ben. Mind you, if you were interested, he was very moody, because you mentioned somebody before, and if you didn't like that person, Ben would disappear and we wouldn't see him at the end of the party because he couldn't bother making small talk.
So, and how did these tutors, tutors that you've written jointly with Marian, and which are used throughout the world and have been enormously influential in the teaching of the piano, how did that collaboration come about?
Well, I can use the word L-U-C-K, luck. On that evening, Jeffrey and I were dining at Harwood, and Ben and Peter were preparing Die Winterreise to sing in the series of concerts in Harwood. And at that moment, I was asked by someone whose name I don't remember if I would write Tutors. But Ben was there. I said, Ben, have you ever heard of this man? He said, never. But why don't you go to my publishers, Faber Music? And it went like that. And to Faber, I've been with Marian all those years. That was the introduction to how I became involved with. And then they asked me to write books to teach children the piano from basics, and we had them decorated, where you used to have funny little rhymes like monkeys climbing in the trees, scratch themselves to catch the fleas. If you see them in the zoo, you may catch a flea or two. And we thought that was marvellous poetry. We used to laugh and laugh, making up these words to fit the rhythms of the music.
And you still have pupils to this day, don't you?
Yes, they come from all over. One of our latest, and you're going to hear too, got accepted at Eton College, and I know they were very impressed, not only at Eton and Harrow, but these days, unless you grab them before they're grabbed by all the pops, you've lost a battle. I find today children hardly go to listen to great music. I will be taken to hear Rachmaninoff, Rubinstein, Cortot, all the great ones. And those were all lessons. You learned how to play, how to get the singing tone, which is the point of departure. I remember Clifford Curzon saying, you can tell from 3 notes whether this person is musical or not. Is it da 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 3, or is it da da da? That's so close. Or is it da da da? And the music floats away. And I often thought of what he said. And we're not wanting to hear mistakes or virtuosic playing. When we're going to listen to a competition, we're not listening for mistakes. We're learning and listening for beauty of tone and what makes the listener listener.
And the lessons that you give at home. I used to have lessons with you at your previous home, but the home, and there's a lovely photograph of Woodgarth there on that stand, and I think it's a stand that belonged to Lord Boyle, if I'm not mistaken.
Lord Boyle's mother, who played the cello.
Boyle's mother. But Woodgarth which you've had now for more than 40 years, has received some very, very famous people in the musical world and indeed in public life. And we haven't got time now to go through the whole list. The whole list of people who have been to your home. But I know that they include, for example, Edward Heath. Did he play on the piano in your home?
He did.
Was he any good?
Not very. But who was Edward Heath? I mean, the day before, police arrived at my door and said, "We've come to discuss about your visitor tomorrow." I said, "Who are you talking about?" "Well, the Prime Minister's been in touch with us and he's coming to Leeds. In fact, he's coming to Leeds University and he wishes to call on you." So we got everything ready for him. Tea and all the nice people of words for the competition. And he went into the kitchen and all he wanted was a whiskey.
But I mentioned all these people who've visited your home, and there must be hundreds of photographs of these people. There are photographs on the pianos, and then if you go into the loo, there are just photographs all over the place.
That's
and
right.
It's surprising that anyone who goes there comes out in less than half an hour.
I invite you all, if we can come to a suitable date. No, that's quite true.
Yes.
They're difficult photos to part with.
Of course.
I must say that I'm most affectionate when I see Rattle and all these players. They are going around the world and they're playing in the greatest concert halls of the world, and they're using the Leeds International Piano Competition in their programs. And it makes me very proud because the great powers here, as Bernard, I believe is, will guarantee that it has, in a way, put Leeds on the musical map.
Now, one of the people that you've got to know a bit, I think, over the years has been Alan Bennett, who
Yes.
it had been hoped would be here today, but he's not very
Sciatica
well.
he's got.
Yes. How did you get to know him?
How did I know? You don't know.
Was that through Harrogate, the festival there?
Oh, he and I did a conversation like you and I.
Ah.
And I remember the people paying £100 a ticket. And so I asked Alan, will you tell me about your school days? Silence. He said, oh, that was pretty boring. So I said, well, after that, you went to Oxford. Can you tell me about that? He said, well, that was boring as well. Well, I was getting nowhere with Alan Bennett. And so I decided I'd take over and tell the people what I had done. But ever since, Alan Bennett, I've been very great friends with him.
Yes. Well, he, as I say, he would have liked to be here this afternoon, but unable to be here. He has actually written a very short note, which I'd like to read out. And he says this: there have been 3 strong-willed women in my life. Miss Mary Shepherd, the lady in the van. More fragrantly, Debo, Dowager Duchess of Devonshire. And more tunefully, Dame Fanny Waterman. Of the 3, I think Dame Fanny just about takes the biscuit. Long may she continue with love, Alan Bennett. And I think that this ought to be added to the archive.
I knew it. I knew you were going to take that from me.
We've not got much more time, unfortunately. I'm sure we could happily go on for another half an hour or an hour, but I've been given strict instructions. So I just want to ask you 1 or 2 more questions. Dame Janet Baker, very important person in your life, who I think is the president, is that right, of the piano competition?
She was until recently.
Right. Can you just tell us a little about her in your life?
Well, Janet I've known all my life. She's a Yorkshire girl, I think, from Yorkshire, and I heard her, and she's regarded as the greatest mezzo-soprano of the day. I know Papano's mentioned this recently. She's not only a great singer, she's a great person, and she listens to lots of children, lots of young people to assess their abilities. And she's one of the kindest, and you will find this with great musicians, unless I'm talking about Wagner, who's supposed to be a terror. But Dame Janet had exceptional qualities.
And then there's Sir Simon Rattle. I know that there's one little anecdote which I think you might like to tell us about with regard to him.
Well, Simon was in the National Youth Orchestra, and my 2 boys were in the National Youth Orchestra. And he used to listen to me taking them in their rehearsals before their performances. And many, many years later, I met Simon in Leeds after he'd performed, and he threw his arms around me, and he said, "Have we met before?" He said, "No, but you've been part of my semi-conscious all my life."
And then a person who, sadly now deceased, but who meant a great deal to both you and to me, is the great Peter Taylor, Lord Taylor, who was Chief Justice for a few years in the early 90s. Just tell us a little about how you got to meet him and you know, what you made of him.
Well, one day a telephone bell went and someone said, "This is Peter Taylor on the phone. I wonder if you and your husband are free to come to Carr Manor and have dinner."
Carr Manor, I should explain, is the lodgings where the judges who come to Leeds on circuit, the High Court judges, they live for the time that they're in Leeds.
And Peter was like you, a music lover. He wouldn't profess to have been a professional, but we played together at Dulwich, and I think the whole of the judiciary came from London, not to hear me, but to hear Peter. And we made £500,000 for the British Heart Foundation. But he was a wonderful person. And although it was grand when you see him, probably here in his red robes and ermine, he was the simplest man. He would say, "Let's get up in the morning and have breakfast in the kitchen in our dressing gowns." It was so human and easy, unless you were there the first day of the judicial day. There is a judicial day, isn't there?
The opening of the year, is it?
That's
the opening
it,
of the legal year, yes. Yes. So, as I say, I think we've just about run out of time, but just to wrap this up, can you just tell us briefly what it is you think what are the most important values that you hold dear to you and that have really kept you going throughout your long and remarkable life?
Well, I can talk to you about my values in music briefly. When you think of it, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, all these great composers reside in heaven with the gods. But that isn't music, it's just sound. What we need are the greatest artists, like we spoke about, who bring all these dots and dashes to life. And if you get that combination of Mozart and the great artist, then you have a glimpse of heaven on earth. That's my feeling about music. And your second question?
Well, I think you've probably answered the
Right.
question I wanted to ask. Well, Fanny, thank you very, very much for having this conversation. I'm sure everybody here has enjoyed it enormously and got a lot out of it. Thank you.